if Trump were actually to put serious pressure on the countries sustaining Russia's economy, such that they stop sustaining Russia's economy, the serious problems Moscow is facing today economically could become critical. So again, if what we're hearing today is implemented rigorously, it could force Putin to change his mind about continuing the war. But only if, in fact, it's implemented and Russia feels the pain will this work.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Herbst spent 3 decades in the US State Department, half of that working on the Middle East, and is a former US Ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan. Ambassador, welcome.
Pleasure.
We've just had the announcement from Donald Trump in that meeting with Mark Rutte, promising secondary tariffs in 50 days if Russia does not end the war in Ukraine. What do you make of that?
This is a step in the right direction. It means that Trump recognizes that Putin has been blocking his efforts, Trump's efforts to achieve peace since at least the middle of March. And for the first time, it's putting serious pressure, or at least threatening serious steps, on the Kremlin for blocking peace.
And we hear alongside that as many as 17 missile batteries and missiles could be sent to Ukraine. Some of those could arrive in days. These are Patriot air defense missiles. How crucial are those at this moment?
Well, first, it's critical because Moscow is using not just drones, but ballistic missiles to murder Ukrainian civilians and destroy cities. And only the Patriots are effective against ballistic missiles. So this will provide relief to Ukraine from these ongoing war crimes. But also, it's a message to Moscow that despite Putin's wishes, Trump recognizes the need for American arms to flow to Ukraine.
And are you happy to see that it's just these air defense missiles, or do you think there's more that the US could be supplying right now?
Well, we don't know if it's just defense missiles. It is true. Patriots are the only thing he's mentioned. It's also true that they are advanced weapons, so he spoke about advanced weapons going to Ukraine. But if Trump truly wants to put pressure on Putin to bring him to the peace table, he needs to help Ukraine provide the weapons that only we can provide that will make Putin's objective of seizing more Ukrainian territory very difficult to achieve.
And as you mentioned, Putin has been playing for time over negotiations for some time now. We have had a few of these missed deadlines already that have been laid down by Trump and the White House. Do you think Russia is going to take this one more seriously, or is there a risk they ignore this as well?
I don't think that these announcements by themselves will have an impact. I think that only when Putin understands that he cannot achieve his gains by continuing the war, only when Putin feels pain in Russia for his ongoing aggression will he reconsider and join negotiations in good faith. So this could be the start of a successful policy, but by itself it will not achieve Trump's goals.
And how do you think the Kremlin more widely will be reading this tariff threat along with this promise of new weapons for Ukraine? I mean, do you think that will have more of an impact than some of the previous threats?
Threats not realized have very little impact. Threats which become policy steps can. So he's going to wait and see if they actually become policy steps. I am confident that the Patriots will start to move and that will have some impact. But again, if he's able to do everything he's been doing, it's just that some of his ballistic missiles or all of his ballistic missiles get shot down. That's not going to move Putin to the peace table. Only when on the battlefield he sees stronger defenses. Only when for the enormous casualties Russia is suffering, they don't pick up a kilometer here or a kilometer there, but no kilometers whatsoever. Then he may consider it's time to end the war.
It has turned out, though, to be a relatively tumultuous year for the Russian economy, hasn't it? There's inflation and recession fears, which are being quite openly discussed at this point by the Kremlin. How much worse could these tariffs make things for Russia?
If, in fact, Trump puts tariffs, it's not so much the tariffs on Russia because we don't have much trade with Russia. It's the tariffs on countries that are purchasing Russian oil or natural gas, or tariffs on countries that provide dual use technology, which find their way into Russian drones which murder Ukrainian civilians. Could this have an impact? So, is China willing to accept serious economic pain in order to help Russia win this war? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe it's no. But there's no harm if our policies stop Putin's aggression to pursue this tactic. So I think if Trump were actually to put serious pressure on the countries sustaining Russia's economy, such that they stop sustaining Russia's economy, the serious problems Moscow is facing today economically could become critical. So again, if what we're hearing today is implemented rigorously, it could force Putin to change his mind about continuing the war. But only if, in fact, it's implemented and Russia feels the pain will this work.
And do you judge that countries like India and China that have been buying a lot of this oil that Russia hasn't been able to sell to the West, do you judge that they're willing to go through much economic strain in order to stick by Russia and to keep buying that oil?
I don't think their objective is to hurt their own economy. I mean, obviously, India is benefiting from cheaper oil because they're buying, in a sense, Russian contraband oil. But if they suddenly find the economic pain outweighs the economic benefit, well, they'll probably change their mind. China's more complicated. As their foreign minister recently dropped his mask and said, oh, yeah, it's to our advantage that Russia not lose this war in Ukraine. Maybe they'll decide some economic pain is worth it for geopolitical advantage. But that, of course, undermines the arguments of some naive advisors in the Trump team who think that there's somehow no connection between China's ambitions on Taiwan and Putin's aggression in Ukraine.
And Trump said that he would be keen to resume talks on negotiations before that 50-day limit that he set. But do you think there's any way that these talks that have been going on in Turkey with Russia and Ukraine can be saved? I mean, is there any trust left with the US, let alone Ukraine, at the moment?
Look, Trump has said different things about negotiations. I mean, he encouraged Zelensky to negotiate at any level with Trump. With Putin. What was it, 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago? And then when Putin jumped out, said, "No, I'm not going to participate." Then Trump said, "Well, of course, you're only going to get a serious outcome if Trump and Putin sit down together." So Lord knows what President Trump will be saying tomorrow about negotiations. But I think he's serious when he says he's open to additional talks with the Russians. But I think it's safe to say Putin's talking points or Lavrov's talking points, if there's a sit down, will not be much greater if that occurs before tariffs hit Russia or Russia's partners for being obstructionist to peace, or if those conversations took place before not just patriots arrive in Ukraine, but weapons which make it far harder to Russia to make any gains on the battlefield.
And what did you make of that 50-day deadline that Trump has set? I mean, would it not have been more useful at this point to make that deadline shorter, or perhaps even have that deadline be basically instantaneous?
Uh, I would not. I look. I agree with the premise of your question that shorter is better. We should have been at this point in the on this issue months ago as opposed to today. But I understand that putting these tariffs down um, could have other unintended side effects that may not always be pleasant. So Trump may want to give Russia a little bit more time to make a deal. So, as someone who's normally looking for more faster, I'm willing to cut the president a little bit of slack. I'm just pleased that we've seen his turnabout over the past couple of weeks.
And were you glad to see more of the responsibility for these weapons being delivered to Ukraine being handed into European NATO members as well? This idea that European countries should buy the weapons from America and then they can decide to pass them on to Ukraine. Do you think that's
Well,
a useful mechanism?
uh, I think that American interests justify American aid in substantial quantity flowing directly to Ukraine. But 31 years in the State Department made a pragmatist out of me. So Trump doesn't want to provide quote unquote aid. So we're talking about sales. Uh, Trump, for reasons I can speculate, would prefer that the U.S. not directly send these weapons to Ukraine. So we use NATO partners. Not those distinctions are not that important. The important thing are serious American weapon supplies flow to Ukraine. Putin was counting on a drying up of American weapons to Ukraine. Obviously, that's not happening. And that's why the past 2 weeks have been a very good thing. Could be better, but given where we've been, this is not bad at all. This is pretty good.
And there has been something of a stop-start of supplies from the US to Ukraine in recent months. Do you think Europe needs to worry about that? I mean, can they rely on the continuing ability to buy these US weapons, or could there be another situation where the US runs out or changes its priorities in terms of weapon distribution?
I can't answer that definitively. Uh, Trump appears to have turned a corner, but he is mercurial, so he could flap back around that curve, right, and be where he'd started. So we just don't know. So I understand caution in Europe. Uh, I do think, however, and that's why I've not been nearly as pessimistic as many of my colleagues regarding Trump and this war. I do think Trump recognizes that if Putin were to win his war with far reduced or no American support to Ukraine, this would be a serious stain on his historical record and national security policy. And as people around him, at least according to the press, were saying months ago, that would be far worse than Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. They're right about that. And Trump may, in his bones, understand it.
And what do you make of Mark Rutte's role in striking this deal for Europe to buy the weapons, and his role more generally in keeping the US on side with NATO?
I think Rutte was a terrific choice. Following Stoltenberg did a good job. I think Rutte was particularly well placed to do this job in the age of Trump. Uh, they got along when he was, head of state or head of government, I should say. And Rutte clearly knows how to approach President Trump, and he's been effective, very effective, even if he said some things that some people found embarrassing.
Trump has said that having a strong Europe is a good thing for the US as well as more
Well,
generally. Do you think NATO is stronger now than when Trump came to power? And if I can add a second question into that, do you think NATO is stronger now since the start of the war with Ukraine?
Uh, it's certainly stronger now since the start of the war in Ukraine. Putin's aggression breathed life into NATO. So now we have these two extraordinary partners that for decades, in some cases longer than decades, were neutral powers, proudly neutral. Because they understand the way certain naifs around President Trump do not, that Russia is an adversary to the West. Uh, 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 whether or not it's stronger or weaker since Trump returned to office. I would make the argument, but carefully, that it is stronger. It's stronger for two very specific reasons. One, the increase in defense and defense related expenditures, including the notion that defense support to Ukraine counts under those expenditures. the linking of those increased expenditures to the Russian threat. That's something that uh, the Biden team was not too keen on pursuing. And frankly, I was surprised when I saw it in the communique because I thought the Trump team was also not keen in pursuing that, especially given some of the peculiar and even embarrassing votes of the U.S. at the UN and the position taken by the U.S. both at the G7 and in the run up to the NATO summit in the communique. But again, the NATO summit communique tied defense expenditures to the Russian danger. That's exactly right, and something we had not seen before. So I would give it Trump the credit. Now we all remember before the summit, people wondered if Trump was going to somehow undermine Article 5. Well, as the Russians certainly saw, didn't happen. Instead, we saw a toughening of the NATO position vis-a-vis Moscow.
And while in that meeting with Mark Rutte today, Trump said he thought the Biden administration did a terrible job for Ukraine. What do you make of Trump's assessment there?
Look, we know that Trump's passion about the Biden administration is high. And passion normally does not go with cool, detached reasoning. I think that's true here. But it is true that, I always said, much to the annoyance of the Biden White House, that their policy was only adequate. And the good part of their policy, they sent a ton of weapons and economic aid, which prevented a Russian victory. But it was weak because, intimidated by Putin's nuclear bluster, they never let Ukraine take the offensive in an effective way. Now, why am I telling you this in response to your question? Because there's a strange synergy between the Biden team and the Trump team. First, many people in Trump world, and I would not put Trump in this category, bought the Biden weakness in being intimidated by Putin's nuclear bluster. You heard that from Tucker. You heard that from the president's son. You heard that from Elon and many, many other writers. They too were intimidated, as Biden had been, as Jake Sullivan been, by Putin's nuclear threats. But there's another element too, which I've just learned relatively recently. Many people, including in the mainstream media, inaccurately talk about the war as if Moscow is inevitably moving forward and going to win. This was conveyed by the Biden team to the Trump team, and they've kind of bought it. So the weaknesses of the Biden team have transferred partly to the Trump administration, at least in terms of their analysis. And that's been an impediment to the good things that we've seen Trump do over the last several weeks. I mean, basically, going back to the NATO summit, which is now 3 weeks ago, Trump has been moving strongly in the right direction, in the direction of a Reaganist peace through strength policy. And thank God for that.
We talk about strength of response for these two governments. For the Trump administration, if Russia doesn't come to the table, which they haven't shown many signs of wanting to do so far, in 50 days' time, are tariffs alone going to work at that point? Or do you think there's more that Trump could do in 50 days to make good on this promise to back Ukraine?
I think it's safe to say that the good decisions we've seen today are part of the same pattern we saw in the Biden administration, which is reacting to events on the ground, or in the air, I should say, and also at the negotiating table. Trump has reacted positively, but in an ad hoc manner. And we saw that with Biden, because he would always refuse to send more advanced weapons until something happened, then he'd send them. It's a similar dynamic. What Biden should have done and never did, what Trump needs to do, and I hold out the possibility this could happen, but I'm not telling you it will, is say, okay, Putin wants to win this war on the ground. That is very much against our interest and against Trump's stated policy. What is the overall policy we need to adopt to make sure that does not happen? And then you lay out the features of a policy that make sure Putin cannot advance a single millimeter on the battlefield without facing other problems on the battlefield. Instead of talking about this in terms of one weapon system or one set of measures that we take today, what's the comprehensive approach? Then you could begin, because we are vastly superior to the Russians in this war. And by we, I mean, of course, the economies and the militaries of the West, first and foremost of the United States, but also the fighting capacities of the Ukrainians. If we use our assets without being deterred by Putin's nuclear bluster, there's no way in the world Russia could advance much farther in Ukraine before they begin to feel very serious problems.
And of course, Ambassador Hubbs, you've dealt in global politics for some time, and especially in Eastern European politics. What do you think Russia's immediate response to this might be in the next few days or even hours?
Because their soldiers go nowhere, or pick up a millimeter here, but then they lose 2 millimeter there. Uh, so, their response to Spiderweb was basically to increase the bombing. That's something they could do easily. Uh, it's a major war crime. It would be nice if more people notice that. Although I do think, by the way, that Trump has been affected by the suffering of civilians, by the fact that it was just a few days ago that Putin bombed the Kharkiv maternity ward after he spoke with Trump. And, that reminds me that in 2018, Trump warned then Syrian President dictator Assad if he uses chemical weapons against civilians, Trump would strike. And Trump did.
Well, Ambassador John Herbst, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report. Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you. Bye bye.